Our second speaker is Professor Amar Al-Chalabi. He is the Professor of Neurology and Complex Diseases and the Genetics Head at the Department of Basic and Clinical Neuroscience and the Director at King's Motor Neuron Disease Care and Research Centre in London. Professor Al-Chalabi will discuss causes of motor neuron disease, which I'm really looking forward to hearing how to answer that. Always the question, why me? Why has this happened? So welcome.
Thank you, Marilee. So I will be talking about what causes motor neuron disease. And one of the things I'd like you to remember while I'm giving this talk is that a lot of things are associated with motor neuron disease, but association doesn't mean causation. So there are two very obvious causes of motor neuron disease: family history and age. We know that because about 5 to 10% of people, when they come to clinic, have a family history in a first or second degree relative of motor neuron disease. And that tells us that because there's a familial component in at least some people, there must be a genetic component in at least some people. The other aspect is age. We know that the older you get, the more likely you are to develop motor neuron disease. Typically, the age of onset is in the 50s or 60s, but actually the age of onset is about 70 in population registers. And that's because the people who come to clinic are generally younger and more motivated. So the actual age, when you do the proper studies, shows that the risk just keeps increasing as people get older. And that tells us that the mechanism is something to do with aging. So I'm just going to deal with the first of those aspects. So how much do genes contribute? We can try and answer that by looking at twins. Identical twins share all of their genetic information, whereas non-identical twins only share half of their genetic information. And both types of twins share a lot of their environmental data, environmental components. So we can look at identical twins and ask, are the same things happening to both twins? If they do, if that happens more frequently than in non-identical twins, that tells us there's more likely to be a genetic component because they share more of their genes. So we've looked at about 170 twin pairs. And in those twin pairs, if you look at the identical twin pairs, in about 5 of those twin pairs, both of the twins develop motor neuron disease. Whereas in 44 of those twin pairs, only one of the twins develop motor neuron disease. And if we look at non-identical twins, then never did both non-identical twins develop motor neuron disease in our group, whereas in all the 122, one of them was affected, because obviously we selected them for that reason. So if you do the maths, that tells you that about 60% of the risk in developing motor neuron disease comes from genetic factors. Now, these weren't twins with a family history otherwise of motor neuron disease. So that's telling you that there's a genetic component for motor neuron disease in general. But why don't we then see a family history in everybody? Why is there a genetic risk without it being inherited? That's because most genes only have a small effect. So this is what's called a Genome-Wide Association Study, or a GWAS, where you look at about, in this case we looked at 40,000 people, 13,000 people roughly with motor neuron disease, and about 25,000 people without. And then we looked at about 17 million different genetic variations in the genome. And we tested each one to see, is a particular genetic variation more common in the people with motor neuron disease or more common in the people without, or is there no difference? And then we plotted that on this graph, and every single dot represents one of those tests. And the higher up on the y-axis that the test appears, the more likely there is that there's a difference between the two groups. And what you can see, all the red ones are where we've seen a genetic signal. There's one very big one, which is the C9orf72 gene, which I'll talk about a little bit in a moment. But you can see there are lots of hits. And that tells you that there are lots of genetic factors that are all contributing. Now, each of these hits will only contribute perhaps 2% or maybe up to 20%, but usually about 2 or 3% to your risk. So it's not a very, very big increase. And that's why we can have a genetic component without it being inherited. It's just telling you those genes are slightly increasing your risk, and they all add up. If you happen to have many of these gene variants, then your risk might have gone up by 25, 30, 40, or 50% compared to the general population. But you're not going to transmit all of those genes to the next generation because we only transmit half of our genes on average. Now, some people do have a family history, as I pointed out, and that's because some genes have a very big effect. They really increase your risk greatly. These are some of the genes that have been found over the last 25 years. You can see that the rate of gene discovery is accelerating. Actually, this slide is about 2 years old, and I haven't updated it because I'd have to add about another 15, 20 genes. The rate of gene discovery is doubling every 4 years. These are for the big effect genes. What I've done here is the graph shows the size of each gene in terms of its importance. So you can see there are 4 particularly important ones on this graph, and they're important because people who study motor neuron disease think they're important, not for any other reason. So SOD1 is the first gene discovered. That's the one at the very left at the bottom. That's important because it's the one we've studied the most. For many years, it was the only gene we really knew had anything to do with motor neuron disease. Then 2 others, TARD-BP, which codes for a protein called TDP43. That protein is found in nearly everybody who has motor neuron disease in their nerve cells, regardless of whether they have a mutation or not. Only 1% of people have a mutation in the gene for that protein, and yet nearly everybody with motor neuron disease has it accumulated in their cells. We don't understand why that is, but it tells us that it's something to do with the disease process. Then there's another related gene, FUS, which tends to cause a very young onset, aggressive type of motor neuron disease. And then the big circle you can see in the middle is for C9orf72. That's a disease gene that, even in people without a family history, can account for up to 8% of the cases we see. Actually, I'm just going to tell you one other thing about those genes. So they're color-coded. You can see that there are blue, red, or green labels. The blue labels are for genes that are to do with the cytoskeleton. That's the skeleton for the nerve cells, because nerve cells are a very strange shape. They're basically a circle with a very, very long tube, and that tube is microscopic, but can be up to 1 meter long. So it's an extremely strange shape, and it needs a strong skeleton to allow that to happen. And several of the genes are involved in the cytoskeleton. The other group you can see is RNA processing genes. RNA processing is the step that your body takes to take the genetic code and make it into you. It's the translation step to take your genes and make them into proteins. So that seems to be important for nerve cells as well. And then the final group is the proteosome genes. The proteosome is the part of the cell that gets rid of damaged proteins. It's like a dustbin for the proteins. So those 3 processes seem to be important for motor neurons. The cytoskeleton, translating the genetic information into proteins, and getting rid of damaged proteins. So the genes have told us that those 3 things are important. Now, some of those genes, as you've heard already from Matthew, are involved in other conditions than motor neuron disease. So, for example, the C9orf72 gene that I told you about, in some people it causes frontotemporal dementia. In other people it causes motor neuron disease and frontotemporal dementia, and in many people it causes nothing. In a few people it increases their risk of Parkinson's disease or schizophrenia. Other genes also can increase your risk of frontotemporal dementia, such as TARD-BP and FUS. Some are involved in another brain disease called ataxia, and some are involved in Parkinson's. And there's also a 14% overlap between the genetic risk factors for motor neuron disease and the genetic risk factors for schizophrenia. So that's an unusual thing to know. Why should motor neuron disease genes also increase your risk for these other conditions? So we can conclude at the moment that one cause of motor neuron disease is your genetic makeup. But it's not clear why there's so many subtypes. Why isn't it just one gene that causes motor neuron disease? And why is there an overlap with these other conditions? So the second obvious cause I told you about was age. So this is a graph of the likelihood that you'll develop motor neuron disease by your age. You can see that your risk just keeps increasing as you get older. You can also see that men always have a greater risk than women. So the ratio is about 3-2 for whether men develop motor neuron disease or women. And that's true even if you've got a disease in your family, a disease gene in your family, which is strange because you have a 50-50 chance of inheriting that disease gene. So for some reason, women are protected in some way from developing motor neuron disease. The other striking thing on this graph that you can see is that by about the age of 85, you've got a 1 in 300 chance of having developed the condition. That's much higher than most people realize. That's your lifetime risk. So most people talk about the incidence of motor neuron disease, which is an epidemiological thing. It's a statistical, technical number. It's the number if you observed a standard population for 100,000 years of one person, or you observed 100,000 people for 1 year, what's the probability that someone will develop motor neuron disease? It's a very difficult number to understand. Whereas your lifetime risk is a very easy number to understand. It's just a chance when you're born that you will die with motor neuron disease. What's that chance? It's 1 in 300. So that means that at a symposium like this, about 3 of the delegates are likely to develop motor neuron disease. That's about the same as for multiple sclerosis. But the reason why multiple sclerosis, actually in the UK, because I don't know what the incidence is in Australia, but I'm assuming it's something similar. The reason multiple sclerosis is more frequent is because it doesn't usually affect your life expectancy, whereas motor neuron disease does. So why is age important? I'll leave you to think about that for a bit. Environmental risk factors are the other big search area in motor neuron disease. Now, whereas genetics might seem a very difficult problem, because we've got 24,000 genes and it's very, very difficult to spot one genetic change in a person, environmental risk factors might seem easier, but actually it's much more difficult because the search space is infinite. And it's not just infinite in terms of the number of environmental things you'd need to ask about. It's also extending over somebody's lifetime. And nobody can remember things from when they were a child, or a potentially simple thing like maybe you knocked your knee when you were a child and it happened to get a particular type of dirt in it or something like that. It could be something really trivial that you'd never know. So the search space for environmental factors is very difficult. And as a result, despite a lot of searching, we don't have any reproducible associations. We've got lots of strong likely associations, and I've listed some of them here, but nothing has been convincingly, definitely shown repeatedly time after time in every single study. So the ones that have the most evidence are military service, particularly if you're deployed in the Second World War. That seems to have increased risk by up to 7 times in some studies. Any place, I'll show you in a little bit. Any lifestyle, smoking is in some studies a risk factor, in other studies it isn't a risk factor. Probably the balance of probability is that smoking is a risk factor, but it's not definite. Exercise or sport is a very difficult one. You heard from Matthew that there is a lot of association with sport. That doesn't mean it's causative. In the same way as drowning and ice cream sales are associated, it's not because ice creams cause people to drown. It's because hot weather makes you makes you eat ice cream and also makes you go swimming. And so the two are associated. So exercise might be associated with motor neuron disease through a third thing in that way. It might also be that, for example, exercise might make the disease slower. It might be protective once you've got it, but have no effect on risk. Now, if that happens, then more of the people we see in our clinic will have been people who are sporty and exercise. It won't be because it's caused it, it's just because they're around longer because it's protected them. So it's a very difficult thing to understand whether sport really does increase your risk. And it may be that people who have a sporty motor system are more likely to get motor neuron disease just because having a sporty motor system is more difficult to maintain. A bit like a Ferrari is a nice sporty car, but it's more expensive and difficult to maintain. In terms of football, which you heard about from Matthew, there was a study in Italy that showed that if you're a professional footballer, you've got about 6 times the risk of motor neuron disease as the general population. So that sounds quite a big effect. In fact, if you do the same study and analyze the statistics a different way, it shows there's no increase in risk. So again, it's a bit controversial, and we're just in the process of trying to repeat that study more globally. We reported 3 footballers who were all amateur footballers, grew up in the same village in Kent in the southeast of England, and all developed motor neuron disease at the same time. 2 of them died on the same weekend. So we reported that because it happened at the same time as this paper on football and motor neuron disease came out. In fact, a 4th person who was in that group of amateur footballers who were all friends playing in the same team at the same time, a 4th person has now developed motor neuron disease. So you might think, well, that's really very strong evidence that football is important. But actually, they all grew up in the same small village in Kent. So maybe it's something in that village that's the risk factor. They're all exposed to the same chalk dust at school and things like that. They all played on the same pitches. They happened to all be electricians, and they'd all had electrical shocks. They all had diabetes. They were all smokers. So we're focusing on football because that's the thing we're interested in, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's football. So that's just an example of how difficult it is to really know how to find an environmental risk factor. Life events such as infection might be important. Electric shock, some studies show it's important, others show it isn't. And physical trauma such as broken bones seem to be at a slightly higher level in people who've then got motor neuron disease, but it's again not clear if that's a definite link. Here's a map of every single person with motor neuron disease over a 10-year period in the southeast of England. So the black dotted line is the border of the study. At the top, it's bounded by the River Thames and by the sea, and along the south and east, it's bounded by the sea. So I don't know if you can see any clusters yourselves. Can anyone see any? Yeah? So there's some around London, there's some around the east tip of Kent. So I've put circles around the ones I see. Now, the problem is, those are just circles that I can see. Now, I told you motor neuron disease is a disease of increasing age. More people in the UK retire by the coast. And so you're going to get clusters by the coast because it's just an older population. Why is there a big cluster in London? Just because more people live in London. Okay? So seeing clustering like this doesn't necessarily tell you anything. You have to take into account all of the other factors and account for them statistically. If you do that, most studies do show a small increase in risk based on where you live or a decrease in some areas. But it usually only increases your risk by maybe 20 or 30% at the most. So there might be something in the soil, in the air, electrical pylons, we don't know, that increases risk for some people. What about viruses? Well, poliovirus causes a motor neuron disease. It causes weakness. Do other viruses? So we and others have looked for that. In fact, other enteroviruses like poliovirus don't seem to cause motor neuron disease of the classic type that we're talking about. But if you look at retroviruses, about 59%, 60% of people with motor neuron disease have a retrovirus signature in their blood, whereas only 5% of the general population does. If you look at relatives, then they also, about 60% of relatives of people with motor neuron disease also have this signature of a retrovirus in their blood, whereas the spouses match the general population. Only about 5% of spouses do. So that tells you it's an inherited pattern of disease, not an infective pattern of disease, which is a bit strange. How can you have an inherited virus? Well, as it happens, you can. There are things called human endogenous retroviruses, which are ancient viruses embedded in human DNA through evolution. They're in the same group as HIV, and in fact, HIV tries to embed itself in your genome if you're infected. So these aren't infective. Everybody's got them. Everyone in this room has many, many HERVs in their body. In fact, 8% of your genome is comprised of these human endogenous retroviruses. You can contrast that with just 1% of your genome that codes for you. So 8 times more of your DNA codes for viruses than does for you. Actually, they've now become so much part of us that they're essential for some things. We use HERV-K, which is one of these retroviruses, to actually form our placenta. So human placentas are formed with this virus. They can't form without it. HERV-K in one study has been found to be a possible culprit for motor neuron disease. It's toxic to motor neurons. If you have mice that express HERV-K, they develop motor neuron disease, and if you put HERV-K into human cells in a dish, then they don't like it. They die. But that would make it a genetic cause, not an environmental cause. There's also the internal environment, the gut bacteria, which seem to influence the immune system. And in people with motor neuron disease, there is a reduction in a particular group of bacteria that produce a chemical called butyrate that your gut cells like. There's a reduced level of that. And the immune system also seems to be important. There's a type of police immune cell called the T regulatory lymphocyte, and that controls how aggressive your immune system is. And in people with motor neuron disease, the levels seem to be lower than they should be. So it may be that controlling your immune system is an important treatment avenue. So it's difficult to find environmental causes as well. Why is that? So I've given you a few mysteries there. So the mysteries are, there's an increasing risk with age. There's no single cause for motor neuron disease. Environmental causes are difficult to find. One gene variant can cause different diseases. Not all gene carriers develop motor neuron disease. I told you about people with C9orf72 who never develop motor neuron disease. It seems to start in one region, as you heard from Matthew, and then spread, and it's specific to motor neurons, but it can include others. So why is all this the case? We can try and learn from cancer. In cancer, we know it's a multi-step process. So you have something like this. You inherit some cancer genes, which are mutated in you. Maybe you smoke, which mutates a few other genes. You might then have a viral infection that activates your immune system a particular way, and then a bacterial infection that activates it again, and maybe you drink a lot of coffee, which activates your cells another way, and then you develop cancer. Okay, these aren't real examples, but they are typical kind of things that you might hear about as increasing your risk. So we can ask, is motor neuron disease a multi-step process like cancer is? So the answer is it's quite easy to tell, because you can use a simple mathematical relationship, which I can explain to somebody afterwards if they want. But basically, if you do a graph of the log of the incidence of motor neuron disease against the log of the age at which you're measuring the incidence, then if it's a straight line, that means it's a multi-step process. And the slope of the line happens to tell you how many steps there are. So we did this in our Southeast ALS register in the UK, and it looks fairly like a straight line. The R-squared number there, you can see, 0.95. The closer that is to 1, the more like a straight line it is mathematically. And 0.95 is a very, very high number to get. So we then went to our colleagues in the Netherlands, actually to Leonard, and this was the result from his register, with an R-squared of 0.99. In Italy, it was 0.95. In Ireland, it was 0.99, and in Scotland, it was 0.97. And when we put them all together, it was still 0.99, which tells you they all had the same slope. And actually, as you heard already from Matthew, it's been confirmed in an Australian register, and that too has the same slope. So it looks like motor neuron disease is a multi-step process, and if you look at the number of the slope estimate, it's actually always around 5, and that's always one less than the number of steps you need. So that tells you that motor neuron disease is a 6-step process on average. We don't know what those steps are, but it tells you there are 6 molecular steps required to develop the disease. We know that genes can account for some steps. So if you happen to carry the C9orf72 gene mutation, then that'll account for 3 of your steps. If you carry the TDP43, that'll account for 2. And if you carry SOD1 mutation, that accounts for 4 of your steps. So you only need 2 more to develop the disease. So that's why those genes have a big effect on your genome. That's why they greatly increase your risk, and that's why in those people, there's often a family history of the disease. They don't have many more steps to get to develop the disease. And this multi-step model explains lots of these mysteries. The increasing risk with age is because you need time to develop all these hits. The fact there's no single cause is because lots of different things might cause the hit. In the same way as smoking can increase your mutation rate, so can having an X-ray or traveling in an airplane or living in a radiation area. Environmental causes are difficult to find because lots of different things can cause the same outcome. One gene variant can cause different diseases, because if you go through steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, you get motor neuron disease, but if you go through 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7, you get frontotemporal dementia, for example. So if you go down different pathways, you might get different diseases. And the reason not everyone carrying a disease gene will develop motor neuron disease is because if they don't have all 6 steps, if they don't have the last ones, they won't develop the disease. It starts in one region because only motor neurons are because only one group of cells will have been affected with all 6 steps to start with, and it's specific to motor neurons because motor neurons must have something that's vulnerable for one of those steps, at least. So the multi-step model explains quite a lot of the reason why people get motor neuron disease. How can we put all this together? Well, we can think of disease like this. So you've got your burden of disease-causing factors and your health, and you're born healthy. You're born with a particular amount of genetic load, and then with time, you get cell damage and you have environmental exposures. But unless you reach a particular threshold of burden of disease, you're not going to get it. So, GTE, genes times environment. If you do have enough of an exposure, then you'll have motor neuron disease, and then you have a self-perpetuating process. And you can imagine the 6 steps along the bottom. So now you can see if you've got lots of the small genetic risk factors, they might account for 1, 2, 3 of the steps. Or if you've got one of the big genetic factors, that might account for a lot of the steps. And it also tells you that if you want to find environmental risk factors, actually what we should probably do is look at people with, for example, SOD1 mutation, because they've only got 1 or 2 steps more to find. Whereas if you're searching in everybody with motor neuron disease, it's going to be more difficult. It's a much larger search space. So just to conclude, motor neuron disease seems to be a 6-step process. Some of the steps can be genetic. It's not easy to find definite environmental risk factors. It looks like military deployment might be important, sportiness might be important, doesn't mean it's causative, and smoking might be important. And it's likely to be a combination of genes and environment, and by environment I mean both the internal and the external environment. So these are some of the people who've sponsored our research. And I'd like to thank all the patients who gave their time to our research, without whom it's impossible. And this is my research team that did a lot of the work you've seen. Thank you.